Hello, everybody. Welcome to the seventh and final lecture on World War II. We are going to cover the Yalta Conference, the Potsdam Conference. We're going to talk about how Germany was divided by the Soviet Union and the U.S. We're going to talk about the U.S. occupation of Japan, the end of the war plan to rebuild Europe, the Marshall Plan. We'll talk about the United Nations, a version of Wilson's League of Nations. And then finally, we'll conclude with the post-war world order, where the big two, the United States and the Soviet Union, emerge as the world's dominant superpowers. So let's jump right into it. This photo shows Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. They met at the Black Sea resort town of Yalta in February of 1945, and they met to make decisions about the post-war status of Germany and Poland. This new big three agreed to divide Germany into 4 zones of occupation. Each would be occupied and administered by one of 4 allied nations: Great Britain, the USSR or Russia, the US, and France. Coming to a consensus or coming to agreement on Poland was really difficult because Stalin wanted to keep Russia's border with the country safe by installing a communist-led government. This would keep Poland firmly under Soviet control. Stalin eventually relents and he gives in and he agrees to let the Poles elect their own government, but this issue of Polish sovereignty or Polish autonomy is far from settled. The big three also agreed to have war crimes trials and to create a new international peacekeeping organization to be known as the United Nations. And today they have their headquarters in New York City. So, on the next slide, we have Attlee, Truman, and Stalin at Potsdam. This is another meeting of the Allied leaders, took place in July of 1945 in Potsdam, Germany, which is a suburb of Berlin. Roosevelt had died in April, so the U.S. was represented by his successor, Harry Truman, who had been vice president and a senator from Missouri. England is now represented by a new Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, whose Labour Party had defeated Churchill's Conservative Party in recent elections. Churchill still attended the conference as well, but he was not there in official capacity. The leaders set more terms governing Germany's future, including provisions for outlawing Nazism in the National Socialist Party, dismantling the German military, reorganizing the German economy, and instituting representative government. They also discussed the shape of post-war Europe, and they issued a declaration demanding the unconditional surrender of Japan. So these men look all very relaxed. You can see Stalin still in his military garb. And the next slide shows the division of Germany and the 3 different zones, or the 4 different zones. And you can see this green area right here is the Soviet zone. That is East Berlin, or East Germany. This west area of West Germany is considered the US zone. Here is the British zone, and then here, the Rhineland. You can see the Rhine River here, separating the French zone. So problems will emerge in the future as a divided Germany will become one of the first ideological battlegrounds in the Cold War struggle between American capitalism and Soviet communism. Ultimately, the American, French, and British zones unite and form the democratically governed nation of West Germany. The Soviet zone becomes East Germany, a communist nation under the control of the USSR, also known as the Soviets, also known as the Russians. So this slide shows you the divisions of Germany, and you guys probably don't know this I think it happened about when you were born, or maybe slightly before you were born, but I think it was 1991, Germany knocks down the Berlin Wall and becomes one country again, and the Soviet Union crumbles. So we're going to talk about the Cold War next, but Now, if you look at the map of Germany, this is all one country again. So many people were afraid of that when that happened, but so far it's happened since 1991. Germany has shown itself to be a very peaceful, very modern, very artistic, and very industrialized society. So the next slide shows Douglas MacArthur and Emperor Hirohito of Japan. This talks about the occupation, which is when U.S. military essentially runs the country of Japan. In September of 1945, the Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, General Douglas MacArthur, moved into the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo, and he remained there for the next 5 years to oversee the American occupation of Japan. Japan had been devastated by the war, and MacArthur supervised the reconstruction of the country's infrastructure, as well as the creation of a new government based on democratic principles. And if you actually read the Japanese Declaration of Independence, the Japanese Constitution, they have almost the same Declaration of Independence and Constitution documents that we do. It's like they took the American version and rewrote it according to Japanese culture. So the next slide is going to talk about the Marshall Plan, and that is the plan to rebuild Europe. And we know that Europe's economy was a total mess after World War II. George Marshall, who was a general, now he's the U.S. Secretary of State. He proposes to aid all European countries that need it. And the plan was also devised to keep communism from spreading into Western Europe. So after World War II, many once thriving nations in Western Europe lay in ruins. The war had not only damaged nations' physical infrastructures, but had destroyed their economies as well. A large segment of the European population remained homeless. Food shortages were common. In 1947, U.S. Secretary of State George C. Marshall proposed a comprehensive plan to save Western Europe from starvation and reconstruct their economies. The European Recovery Program, later simply called the Marshall Plan, was designed to help nations rebuild and also provided for former enemy nations, such as West Germany, to receive aid from the United States. Even the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc nations were initially invited to share in the financial aid from the plan. Requirements for the use of the money were simple. Basically, European countries had to use the money to purchase American-made goods, which would be shipped in American vessels. In addition, any material purchased had to be used only for rebuilding and not for military purposes. The Marshall Plan becomes an international success. 16 nations used the aid to rebuild, receiving a total of $13 billion. And the plan also ends up providing a political benefit. After its implementation, no European nation fell to the communists. So we will struggle with communists over Southeast Asia and Vietnam and Korea. We'll talk about that during the Cold War segment. But our next slide is going to talk about the United Nations. And the United Nations is an international peacekeeping organization. FDR was the principal architect or the vision behind the UN, which we also know was just another version of Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations, but this time there was a little bit more American input. So we'll talk about the goals, we'll talk about the successes and failures of the United Nations. So although the previous League of Nations had failed to prevent armed conflict in the years leading up to World War II, world leaders after the war still recognized the need for an international organization dedicated to maintaining peace. To achieve that goal, the United Nations was created. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the principal architect or the creator of the United Nations, and he had even coined the phrase United Nations to describe the 26 nations that allied together to fight the Axis powers during World War II. Roosevelt unfortunately dies prior to the first meeting of the UN. His wife Eleanor becomes a member of the first UN delegation, which met in the summer and the fall of 1945 in San Francisco. The purposes of the United Nations included keeping the peace, encouraging respect for human rights, creating conditions under which justice and respect for international laws and treaties could be achieved, and promoting social progress and better standards of living throughout the world. Though the UN has proved much more successful than the League of Nations, it has not always been able to act with authority that it would like. The organization has accomplished much with its humanitarian efforts and has enjoyed some peacekeeping successes. However, it has not been able to prevent large-scale armed conflicts such as the Vietnam War, nor has it always been able to keep superpower nations such as the United States, Russia, and China from taking unilateral action when they disagree with UN positions on an issue. So the UN continues to operate. Their headquarters are in New York City. It's a beautiful building. If you get to go visit, I highly recommend it. And the UN contributes to what we call the post-war world order. And on the next slide, you'll see the flags of the Soviets, the flags of the US. Of all of the Allied nations, the United States emerges the strongest from World War II. Other than Pearl Harbor, no fighting had taken place on American soil. This meant that, unlike its European allies, the United States does not have to rebuild its infrastructure. The war not only pulled the U.S. economy out of the Great Depression, but it made the U.S. the preeminent economic power in the world. Britain and France were not so fortunate. The war had not only brought physical and economic devastation to them, but it ended up costing them their overseas colonies. Neither would be a dominant world power after 1945. Although the Soviet Union had suffered greatly during the war, it emerged in a much stronger position than Britain or France. The Soviets used the threat of their military might to install communist-led government in the Eastern European countries along Russia's western border, turning them into, quote, satellite nations. Also, despite the United States' efforts to keep the technology behind the atomic bomb a secret, Soviet scientists, aided by information gathered from espionage or spies, developed a nuclear bomb by 1949. As the world's only two nuclear-armed nations, the US and Russia emerged as superpowers by the start of the 1950s. And when we talk about the Cold War, we'll talk about what's called nuclear proliferation, which is where the US and the Russians have essentially an arms race. They produce as many nuclear weapons as they can, assuring that if any country strikes the other will retaliate in an effort that's certain to destroy the entire world. And this is called the MAD theory, which stands for mutual mutual assured destruction. So when two countries each have something to lose, they're not going to launch the missiles at each other, in theory. And it worked because neither side did, although we come close in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So finally, the United States and the Soviet Union fought together as allies during the war, but ideological differences become a major point of contention after the war. The struggle between communism and capitalism would dominate international politics for the next 40 years as America and the USSR engage in the Cold War. Although the countries never engaged in armed combat, primarily because of the devastating consequences of starting a nuclear war, they battle each other indirectly, trying to extend their own global influence while counteracting that of the other. And that, my good friends, wraps up World War II. Make sure you review your notes. I know this was a lot of talking, not a lot of words on the slides, so hopefully you've got a lot of the content down. You should try to give yourself a timeline of World War II. You should write down the key players from each country. And again, just review these videos as often as you'd like, and good luck on the quiz. Have a great night.